All right, without further ado, here's Ashleigh Weeks from the Fort Peck Tribes.
Well, I'm happy to be asked to share my experiences of conducting an emissions inventory. I am an enrolled member of the Fort Peck Assiniboine tribe. I was born and raised here. I've been working with the Office of Environmental Protection for over 6 years, but I previously did some internship work with the office where I did do an emissions inventory. I went through the training manuals for the TICE coursework probably about a decade ago, and since did the online tutorials when they became available. This is just a little map, the TICE's map of Montana, and Fort Peck is highlighted up here in the corner. We're pretty close to the Canadian border and North Dakota. This is just a big map of the Fort Peck Reservation. It encompasses over 2 million acres. Agriculture is the primary economic activity, and most of our communities are located in the southern portion of the reservation along Highway 2, and the southern border is the Missouri River. Under the Prevention of Significant Deterioration program, our reservation was classified as a Class 1 airshed back in 1982, and since then has had strict limitations on any major stationary sources. We do have one major source. It's the Northern Border Pipeline, but is still regulated under EPA. So my very first steps when I first began the emissions inventory was to go through all the pertinent AP 42 sections. I highlighted every known source within these sections that I knew I would be inventorying on the reservation. I reviewed the sections in detail, studied the emission processes, their associated emission factors, looked through the diagrams and the schematics, and then started developing data gathering sheets or surveys for each source category. I put together a generic letter to request information in TICE. You can find these links through the calculator page. The calculators are based on the AP42 emission factors. For example, waste oil, you can get to that AP42 section and then go in, and the description describes everything you need to know to calculate emissions. So I did have to study each one of these. I made a lot of copies, notes, and it was a good step for me in collecting data. The most recent emissions inventory I did in 2015 was to prepare a QAP. I found it online. I found a template online and just filled it in according to how I would be doing my inventory. This was really helpful for me. It helped me set up the process to collect the data, helped me define what information I need to be collecting, reminded me of the steps taken to make estimations, and even how I investigated the sources.
So you're saying your QAP was useful to you in the process of your emissions inventory?
In preparing me to start the emissions inventory, yeah, I did it the year before I actually started collecting. So I believe this was in 2014, and then when 2015 rolled around, I kind of had everything set up. I had my letters and my surveys all done, and I just kind of had to send them out and wait for my information to come back. It really did help me because a lot of time is needed to collect data, and there was plenty of time for them to call me back and ask questions, and I was able to really hunt them down and make sure I got figures from them. It really did make it go a lot smoother. Another important step for me before I started any of my emissions inventories was to go through the TICE calculators. For each source category, I printed out the blank sheets for the calculators, really looked into the units and each content factor within the calculators to make sure I was asking enough questions to be able to make some calculations. That also helped point out all of the different processes that are available within that source category. I think the TICE calculators have been improving, and I'll show some more examples of that in a minute. So we have both point and non-point or area sources. Most point sources are gas stations, grain elevators, auto repair shops. We also had sand and gravel pits, asphalt plants, airport emissions, and the one Title V permit for Burlington Northern. The non-point sources include agricultural-related emissions, processes for tilling, harvesting, and transporting. We looked at heating from both natural gas and propane, on and off-road dust emissions, wildfires, and like asphalt paving. This is an example of the first step I took in the emission inventory process, highlighting the AP 42 sections. I initially had to do a lot of reading to figure out where and how the sources emit pollution. Like you mentioned in the beginning, it wasn't very intuitive to figure out where I'm going to find the used oil burners, which are under waste oil combustion. Little terminology things were something I had to study and get past. Again, here are my area sources. For the most recent emissions inventory, I've added fertilizer and pesticide applications. I also moved the automobile surface coating operations and solvent degreasing from point sources to area sources because those calculators became available in TICE. My data collection process always begins with creating these data gathering sheets or surveys and letters. I'll have to do a little bit of research in the beginning for contact information, but everything's usually been online, or I just had to make a phone call to the facility for the manager's contact information, and then I'd send out my letters, my surveys, and if I didn't hear back right away, I'd call or email and check if they received my survey or if they were having any problems with it or didn't understand something. And if I had trouble contacting anyone, I would go do a site visit. I found some information on the internet. I tried to stick to government websites. I used the U.S. Census and still kind of made some rough estimates based on the information I found. I included an example of the last generic letter I sent out to sources. They've all been pretty basic. I think I've even found some examples or templates online and try to figure out the best way to do my letters. But basically we'll just try to tell what the emission inventory is and who I'm turning it into or why it's needed, time frame of the data being collected, and I'd include the data gathering survey sheet and a stamped return envelope, so it'd be easiest for them. This is an example of a data gathering sheet I created. I made this for gas stations. Since my first emissions inventory, I've been improving my letters and my surveys. I've been trying to make my surveys as close to the TICE calculators as possible by just requesting all the information that are in the calculators, and whether I get results back for it, just try to do the best estimating. But Angelique has been helpful with that part. Then I did this for each source category, such as gas stations and grain elevators and asphalt plants. But these surveys have made a difference, big difference for me since sending out the first generic letters. I think I even included an example of one of my first surveys, which I can't believe I sent out. But so, for example, this is what I asked back in 2005, flash filling, underground tank breathing and emptying, and they had no idea what I was talking about. I didn't even really probably know what I was talking about, but I had just seen that this is what's asked for gas stations. You know, it's a lot easier to ask how much fuel was sold last year rather than asking their throughput in 10 to the third gallons. Also easier just to ask how their underground tanks are filled, giving them the options available from the calculators, and a simple yes or no answer if they have recovery systems in place. And then go into my calculator, and like I said, I previously went through these calculators and figured out exactly all the processes I will be including. Like here I've added underground tank breathing and emptying and spillage, but I didn't really have to ask any of that in my surveys because I knew it had to be included, and they would have no idea what I'm talking about.
Ashleigh, was it helpful for you to go there? Like when they didn't know what you were talking about, what was your next step after that?
I went back to those AP 42 sections and figured out exactly what those different processes were talking about. I made copies of the schematics. I think for like the gas station, there's a picture of what a recovery system looks like, and then I'd have got descriptions of what I meant by splashed filling and submerged filling, the balanced submerged filling, and I think even at times the gas stations were confused, so we just would do the best we could. So this is another example for some research I had to do for the hot mix asphalt plants. This is the calculator sheet, and again I did this for each source category. But so basically here there was either an option of the batch mix or the drum mix, the fuel used in the process, and emission controls. So my sheet, I basically put those options all out there and asked for the information, just I think in a little bit different way. Tice is all those scroll down options, and you can't really see it until you highlight one or the other. I had to kind of play around with those and go through each one and see what would be highlighted if I clicked on this, or which spot I would have to fill in. And another example for propane collection, I guess one little thing I wanted to point out here is that I did put my notes on the sheets after I collected data. I would write the date that I entered them into Tice, and then we'd highlight them after we QA/QC'd them. And then I'd always have this for my notes for the next emissions inventory. Here we got sales from the only propane distributor on the reservation for each station, and then we made further estimates of how many sales were on the reservation, like Nashua and Freud are just off the reservation, but some of these homes are still within the reservation border. Wolf Point has a lot of their sales going across south of the Missouri off the reservation, so we cut down those estimates, came up with the total, and then added that in there in the calculator. I never did really get a sulfur content, but Angela, during our QA/QC process, found me a content number to throw in there, and it did make a big difference in the calculations. My last example for my data gathering sheets is for grain elevators, just to basically point out that the Tice calculators, researching them, reviewing them beforehand, help point out the different processes that I could be asking data for. In the very first emissions inventory, I only looked for shipping and receiving numbers, but since then, cleaning, drying, internal handling, and this storage bin emission processes have been added for each grain elevator. Had a lot of lessons. I mean, I've learned a lot of lessons through each emissions inventory, and my biggest thing has been trying to make sure that the surveys that I'm sending out are easily understood, they're easy to fill out, and I try to include as much information with these, even if I'm sending a big little packet to them. In the past, I sent their last emissions they reported just to give them an idea of what kind of numbers that I'm looking for. I sent copies and schematics from those AP 42 categories, and again, I was sent a stamped return envelope for them. Also an email address, a fax number, a bunch of ways to contact us or send it back. Another thing to keep in mind is it takes a lot of time to collect the data, so starting as early as possible is helpful. getting the letters out right away, letting them know that you're looking for this information. Since my first emissions inventory, the people that I've been contacting are starting to remember me now, and I think they kind of expect it, and my collection process has been getting easier and faster. And then in the beginning, many business owners, the local owners and the managers always wanted to know why I was doing this inventory, why I needed the information, and I think it only took one or two times, and then after that I was sure to have some good reasons why I was doing the survey. And I think I added a lot of that information in my letters too after that, but in this last one I took it out again, so it's kind of up to you if you feel you need to explain it more, or if people are requesting you to explain it. And then having those like health-related issues that come from bad air quality always, I think, seems to make people want to help. I think I always needed to be familiar and reminded of the technical terms for each different source category, but still be able to communicate with them. I couldn't get too technical, because then sometimes, even though they didn't know what I was talking about, and then I'd really feel unsure, awkward, I don't know. And then the units, and you can figure those out from the TICE calculators, and then converting them. I know the first time I asked for natural gas figures, they didn't know how to convert it for me, I think. So they gave it to me in what they report under. Then I had to try to find a way to convert it to fit the TICE calculator. It's kind of tricky. I've thought I was really good in math, but I still confuse myself. But Angelique has always been super helpful. And then lastly, sometimes I had trouble getting information from the local grain elevators, so I started contacting their corporate headquarters, and then they just like immediately sent me the information. They had it all recorded, and for one of the bigger grain elevators, they put me in contact with their environmental engineer, and we've been since kind of helping each other out. They're actually doing a new construction and are required under the new source review to do a minor source permit. Always have a surprise with each emission inventory, and it's mostly something I learned or something that finally clicked and I kind of figured something out. And I've also been surprised at how useful Excel is. I've been in some of these processes, I get a lot of numbers, and it's just easier to get it downloaded into a table and sum it all up really easily, and could even use it to make my surveys. I'm always so happy that Angelique can help me out, and she's been able to follow the work I've been doing and then like catch every little thing that I was unsure about. And for example, I've said she gave me a different sulfur content for the calculators, and like for on and off road dust emissions, there were a lot of unknown content areas there, but she helped me fill it in, and it did make a big difference in the calculations. Surprised at knowing how much emissions are out there, are being emitted. Obtaining information is getting better. Most are pretty quick and simple, but we did have one company, a bigger gas station, wanted us to sign a confidentiality agreement that we wouldn't share their gas sales. Another like small, I think it was an auto body owner, refused to do the survey, kind of got upset with me, and it was those same questions of why do you want this? Well, why do I have to do this? But I think that was the first emissions inventory I did, and I was a little at a loss for words, so I just kind of left, and I made some estimates based on similar auto body shops, what their figures were. Online data, take some digging, got to do some little investigating, but at first I did go to some local departments, the Natural Resources Office. I went to the BIA Fire Department, and they directed me to the different websites where they thought I could find the information I was looking for. So like NRCS told me about the numbers I can find for harvested croplands, and I use these numbers to do the harvesting, tilling, transporting. This is actually from my notes. I just kind of did a screenshot of where I collected this information for my QA/QC work. Very important step is data management. I've learned to document everything. I store it everywhere. I store it inside of Tice, my notes, back it up on some jump drives. I have it on a couple of computers. I have it sent to my email. I've always had to go back and look at this information. I'm always worried that I'm not going to have it or something's going to happen to it, so I know I have it in a few places. I've learned to keep really detailed notes, who was contacted, the information I was asking for, what they gave me, how I made conversions, even did the snapshots of the different websites I used. And then when I was done with all my surveys, I made my notes on there. I would scan them in and also include those as a part of my notes for the QA/QC. And I would send this all to Angelique, and she'd use it to look over my work. I just did a quick example of how I screenshotted my work for wildfires. Did every screen I'd go to and like highlighted where I was getting the information down to Fort Peck, downloaded it into an Excel file, summed it up, and then threw that 3,700 acres into my calculator, got some emissions. Another important, but one of the last steps of the emissions inventory is doing the QA/QC work. I did kind of develop this a little bit better too as I've been going through my emissions inventories, and the QAP that I did really helped highlight some of these QA/QC checks. So some of those things I was looking ahead of time for accuracy, completeness, representativeness, comparability. So saw in the QAP of how I was going to do each process, each step. I also found an old Excel spreadsheet that was done on the earlier emission inventories, I think around 2000, 2001, and I just had a quick example of it. Anyways, I'd use these for a QA/QC check also. And this is basically a Tice calculator. They'd enter in all the emission factors, and then they'd find the throughput, and then they'd calculate the emissions for each pollutant. I'd enter this in Tice, and then at the end I entered it all into this Excel book, and then compared the numbers. That's not really necessary, but it was kind of neat to see how those calculations are really laid out. But it's pretty neat too, so I don't ever want to let it go, even though it's kind of just like doubling my work. But all of this is used for again, my notes, and then I turn it all into Angelique. She goes through each one of these calculations and then sends me back her adjustments. As an example, I've been collecting this natural gas heating and in decatherms, but have apparently been making the wrong conversions all this time, but she corrected it for me. She put it back into the Tice project, and then the Tice inventory I received back for her has all these emissions, and she did this for every single source and facility. She's very thorough with her work and pretty awesome. After it's all said and done and we have some results, we've been going back and kind of assessing trends. My boss, I think, started here at OEP back in '87, and it was basically just an air program. And so they started contracting with this Air Science Inc. Started with like a feasibility study of what kind of air program we could develop here for the reservation. And the first step was doing an emissions inventory. I think my boss said she did the first one back in around 93 or 94 and began with inventorying the one major source, the Northern Border Pipeline, and then realizing that we didn't have enough major sources to do a major source program because it's self-funded. They recommended we look into doing a minor air source reporting program. And then now, since the new source reviews came out, we've switched it to include a minor source permitting program for new and modified sources. So I think this work has been going on since then, but it kind of got ready around 2009, and then they were made aware that EPA was coming out with a similar minor source program, and so went back and looked at it all again to make it similar to the federal program so we wouldn't have a lot of problems. I think right now our biggest issue is kind of the enforcement part, and we are trying, I mean, it's up to the board, but to decide the best option of, and it's against non-Indian offenders. So, like, would we keep it as a Class A misdemeanor or refer them back to EPA? And the worry is that it could be costly if it goes into a legal battle, and do we really want to be spending our money on every little misdemeanor or something like that. But it's been pretty interesting. I've been learning so much since I started working here, and then kind of step away from it and do some different work and then come back to it. So I've been keeping pretty busy with this air quality work. Our office also does the water quality, pesticides, brownfields, solid waste, underground storage tanks. We have underground injection control, and I kind of work with each program, but most of the work is with the air program. So in developing our minor source air permitting program, they're going to be mostly dealing with grain elevators. They've been producing the most as far as particulate matter. And then I think if we've had another major construction of a gas station, it might need one too. Our gas station numbers are pretty high. Just the summary table of the pollutants that we've been using, tracking trends with from each source category. These numbers have all been included to help support the air quality program. Advice for TICE, I really like working with it. I think it's really user-friendly. I did that first coursework over 10 years ago, and I can still get into TICE and figure it out. I do have to kind of look around, and I'm always happy to see the improvements. It was really helpful to kind of build the TICE project and, like I said, go through those sections and figure out the different processes that you can kind of see through the calculators. I added in there again to add notes into the TICE project for those quality assurance, quality control checks. And I don't know if it's that big of a deal, but if I could go back again, I would try to complete most of those processes for each category. When we've been tracking trends, it kind of looked like we had some huge spikes in emissions, but I actually was just adding processes, so I had to go back and take some of those processes out and do a summary again, so show those trends without the processes that I just added. And again, the QAP was helpful. Continuing to develop my surveys or my data forms, it's been making the collection process a lot easier. The very first emissions inventory I did about a decade ago, I probably had maybe a 20% back, and then I had to really go out and bug people, but it was mostly because they had no idea what I was talking about in my surveys. So I had to do a lot of site visits and phone calls. Now recently that I've been making my forms and my letters a lot more clear, I think my return rate has probably been like 80%. Even had a lot of where I could email these letters and these forms, and then they'd shoot it right back online, digital. It was really helpful. Yeah, I rarely, this past emissions inventory, I don't think I really had to leave my desk at all. It's nice because, like I said, I do a lot of work in different programs, and my time is really limited, so it would take a lot. I mean, it would take like maybe a whole day to drive to the other side of the reservation to meet with this one grain elevator and sit around and wait for someone that I could talk to or that had this information. Yeah, in the beginning I did kind of really have to explain myself and who I worked for, and just mentioning EPA, I think, kind of made people want to help me get the information too.
I just want to say thanks to Ashleigh for presenting today, and I also wanted to add that when she says that she's really surprised at how well I followed her level of detail, the reason why I was able to follow that so well is because she documented it so well. And that's why I've said over and over again how important it is to document everything and keep everything. Because when I come down the road and review your emissions inventory and look at it and say, what is this number and how did you do this conversion? If I can look at it, that helps so much. So documentation is just so important. And like that right there, those writing on the side of the little data collection sheets, I use those. And it just improves the accuracy of your emissions inventory, and it's so important. And it, like Ashleigh said, when you step back and you do other work, and then 3 years later you do an update to your emissions inventory, that's so important to have those notes to look back at how you did things. So it's just important for many reasons to document everything.
Hi, Ashleigh. This is Chris calling from the TAM Center. I just want to say that presentation that you provided was really good, and I'm really happy to see that the support tools that we utilize, and especially the support from Melinda and Angelique, was really helpful to you, and you did a really great job. This is really good. I really appreciate it.